Redditors who have found dead bodies. What's the story? My wife and I arrived early at an accident that happened only moments before on the highway. Two other guys and I jumped from our cars to try to help a very old man who was seemingly trapped in his car. I remember thinking he must still be alive because his eyelids flickered rapidly, but also realized that there was not blood flowing from his open wounds. When the medics arrived, they just quickly glanced at him and assured me that he was definitely dead already, and I would not need to bother anymore. The only things haunting me afterwards were the smell of burning coolant oozing from the car and his crystal blue eyes. As I find out later, he was a local farmer who came from his field, drove onto the highway from there, and just turned onto oncoming traffic. Also, as we left, we passed 2 to 3 other cars with injured people who I could have actually helped if we had not stopped at the very first wreck we saw. This was about 25 years ago. Didn't think about it for a decade. I had my friend's neighbor die in my arms. He was about 55 and not in good health. I was sitting on the front porch of my friend's house chatting to the neighbor as he worked on his car. Next thing, he stumbled towards me with a strange expression on his face and falls in my arms and dies. I actually saw the light go from his eyes, tried CPR and rang an ambulance which arrived in minutes, but it turned out he had a massive heart attack. I was an apartment manager for 20 plus years. Received a call from a neighboring apartment that the girl next door was screaming, "My mom is dead." I ran up to the apartment with my maintenance techs and didn't even see all of the blood on the walls and carpet. Got to the back bedroom and found my resident, a 43-year-old nurse, dead with her throat slit and had been stabbed 40 times. Her 16-year-old daughter had found her when she returned home from school. The victim's ex-boyfriend had found her and her daughter in our city after they had escaped his terror from 2 states away and murdered her. He ended up getting life in prison and I had to testify at the trial. This guy was such a freak that he tried to attack the bailiff and the judge during his trial. It was Mother's Day of 2020. My best friend's mom called me and asked if I had heard from said friend at all that day. I said no, and she asked if I would go check on him. I quickly drove over to his house and walked right up like I always did, and found him dead, OD on fentanyl. I quickly called 911. They came and asked me about 200 times where he got the dope from and all that. I had no idea, but they just weren't accepting that answer. After talking to about half a dozen different detectives in the coroner, they finally allowed me to leave. Telling his mother on Mother's Day that her son was dead was the absolute hardest thing I've ever done in my life. She lives several states away, so I had to tell her over the phone. Crushed me. That was her second son to die of an OD. This was 15 years ago or so. Sitting in the parking lot of a Chuck E. Cheese in Bradenton, Florida, waiting for my husband at the time to get out of Publix with band-aids for the blisters my shoes made. 6-year-old nephew in the back seat waiting to go into Chuck E. Cheese. A man gets out of his truck to meet a woman, baby and toddler. Looked like a custody trade-off. The kids were put in his truck, they hugged, then he pulled a huge butcher knife out and stabbed her at least 10 times, right in front of my car. I yelled at my 6-year-old nephew to get down, close his eyes, and stay down. The man then got gasoline from the back of his pickup, poured it on himself, and lit a lighter. This now was next to my window. He looked at me while he was lighting himself. I then jumped out, opened the back door, and told my nephew to run as fast as he could into Chuck E. Cheese and get an adult. The man walked on fire what seemed like an eternity. He died. The woman lived. I'll never forget his skin that was left on the concrete. I was in an organization who were going on an overnight canoe camping trip down the local river, staying on an island centered in the water. We get a couple hours down the river and me and my buddy are leading the pack with our canoe. We're coming up on the rapids at this point, so I see a lot of rocks jutting out of the frothy water, not really questioning what the very, very pale one lying in an awkward position. As we and the rest of the troop got closer, it was pretty obvious what the rock really was. Some kids behind us drifted in pretty close and got the unfortunate glimpse of a naked, waterlogged old mother who was brutally beaten and by 2 psychopaths that were found the next day. The cops told us it was a suicide because they didn't want us to be scared. But a couple weeks after, I looked up the incident and found out what really happened. When I was 9, I had horrible anxiety, especially at night, so my single mom would let me sleep in her bed with her. We would watch movies together before bed, and she would try to tickle me or joke around to make me laugh so I was at ease and would breathe easier and fall asleep. One night we rented a movie each of us wanted to watch. I chose Page Master and she chose Sleepless in Seattle. She of course let me watch my movie first and we'd watch hers the next night. The next morning I woke up an hour late for school and started freaking out. I was a high-strung, short-tempered kid, so I was yelling pretty loud. Enough for one of my sisters to run in and tell me to shut up, and we started fighting. It was after a minute or so we both realized Mom hadn't budged while we were screaming at each other. I nudged her a couple times to see if she was asleep. Normally she snored, but she was silent. I then leaned into her pillow to see if her eyes were open. I've never regretted a decision as much since. Her face was purple and blue, but only on the side touching her pillow. On the other side was just colorless. I remember screaming "Mom" in the loudest, shrillest voice. The next thing I knew, my two sisters had rushed me into another bedroom because they did not want me to have to witness anything else. I could hear my oldest sister on the phone. She was yelling at the other end because they wanted her to do chest compressions, and she just kept yelling, "She's dead. She's dead." Basically asking the operator what the point of CPR is if she's already gone. Minutes later, I remember hearing sirens, screeching, and a familiar voice rushing through the front door. We lived in a really small town, maybe a few hundred people, so the paramedics were volunteer. I opened the door to the bedroom, and the volunteer paramedic who came in was my third grade teacher. She walked into my mom's room, and a few minutes later, I simply heard my sister wailing as my teacher tried to console them. She walked out of the room with my oldest sister, and they told me what I already knew. My mom, my movie buddy, my best friend, was gone. From where we were standing, I could see the doorway to the bedroom, but all I saw was my mother's arm still hanging from the edge of the bed. I started silently begging her arm would move and she'd somehow wake up. I've never felt grief like that, crying so hard that everything just went dark. It was 23 years ago last Thursday. Even after years of therapy and trauma counseling, I still sometimes struggle to sleep because I close my eyes and I see her face, every detail as much as I want to forget. It took me 2 decades to finally watch Sleepless in Seattle, on the 20th anniversary of the day with my wife and son. I can't leave the room without telling them both I love them, and I never will, because you just never know. Years ago, I worked with a guy who was a manager at a major chain hotel, Courtyard maybe, and left to go into sales. Since it was such a random change, I asked him why he left, and he explained for over an hour about all the suicides he dealt with, as he was usually the one that found the bodies. Apparently, hotels are very popular for suicides, as they do not want the family to discover their dead body, so they rent a room for several days to make sure they succeed and aren't found and revived, and do it in private. He said in the end, he was pretty good at spotting the sign of a suicidal person since they'd usually book a room for a few days, but do not have any luggage. Most of the time, it was drug overdose or lethal ingestion of sleeping pills, but the one that caused him to quit was a cutter. He came into the room to investigate after they hung the Do Not Disturb sign up for several days and found this woman's body lying in the bathtub with blood all over the bathroom. Apparently, it was so traumatic he quit later that week and never wanted to go back into hotel management again. Not me, but my brother. Brother is a maintenance worker for an apartment complex with just one other employee. There was an incident years ago where quite a few tenants complained of an awful smell in their apartment. Brother and his coworker both thought it might be a gas leak, so they checked for that and everything looked fine. Upon talking further, they realized that all of the complaining tenants lived in the same building unit. Each unit houses 4 apartments, and 3 of the 4 were complaining. My brother realized that neither he nor his coworker had seen the 4th tenant in quite some time. He brought attention to the management office, and they gave him permission to go ahead and enter the 4th tenant's apartment. My brother said he will never forget the moment they opened that front door and the amount of horrible odor that came flooding out. At that moment, they knew the tenant had died in the apartment. Apparently, he had been dead for some time because his body was completely bloated. They found him laying on the living room floor, likely had a heart attack. I have found 2. One when I was 12, I went to wake up my 89-year-old grandmother for breakfast. She had passed in her sleep in her bed. This was not traumatizing. When I was around 30 and working as a social worker, I had a client with schizophrenia. She was 67 going on 87. Meds, diet, and bulimia had taken a terrible toll on her. Anyway, she was frail and small, kept mostly to her apartment. I would take her out at least twice weekly, typically 3 times to get lunch. It It was in part so I knew she was eating, and just to get her out of the house. Better than her just having interactions with her delusions and hallucinations. I had a fear that one morning I would come to get her and she would be gone. This came to fruition in roughly 2012. Anyway, it was Monday morning. Time to take her to the psychiatrist. This was for a check-in and for a monthly shot of antipsychotic. If I remember, it was haloperidol. She was not opening the door. She had done this before and was just skitzing out, claiming I was a damned mortician there to take her to the morgue. Building manager let us in. I saw her on the floor. As soon as I touched her, I knew she was gone. Cold and stiff. A blood bile discharge that was dry had seeped out of her mouth. I gently rolled her over, cradling her head in case I was wrong. I checked for a pulse, could not find one. The smell was rough. She kept the place hot, and it was extra rough, from the beginning stages of decomposition. Anyway, 911 took forever to get a cop out there. Cop made the coroner come out, just so dumb. It was clear that she had fallen and hit her head. No one heard her if she cried out. She died very early Sunday morning, 1 a.m.-ish, and this was now Monday. So roughly 30 to 32 hours. Anyway, that's the story. I attended the funeral and cleaned out her apartment. Got the TV out of there. Her family said she would have wanted me to have it. And that's it. Oh, I had dreams for a while afterwards about her calling out for me to help her. By herself, laying on the floor sobbing and in pain. Kept me up for a few nights. I felt guilty for not saving her. How could I though? Eventually they stopped. Peace.